Boldwood presents Murder at the Ponte Vecchio, written by T.A. Williams and read by Simon Mattox. Chapter 1. Friday afternoon. In a city as cosmopolitan as Florence, you see all sorts. Of course, there are the usual groups of tourists from all over the globe being herded about by guides waving flags, some even carrying their own microphones and loudspeakers. But sometimes you see some quite unique sights, and I'm not just referring to the Duomo or the statue of David. Since setting up Dan Armstrong Private Investigations here in the city almost 2 years ago, I've got used to seeing people in medieval dress parading through the streets, tractors and trailers loaded with manure heading for the local government offices to complain about something or other. Regular groups of protesters carrying banners advocating everything from saving the whales to legalising cannabis, and even a cortege of 100 or so naked cyclists one freezing cold morning. But today was a first. As I made my way from my office to Anna's apartment, just on the other side of the River Arno, I suddenly found myself confronted by a group of tigers. Or should that be a pride or a pack? I hasten to explain that these were not real members of the big cat family, but humans dressed up as tigers. The month of April had been particularly mild so far, and the temperature showing on the illuminated sign above the entrance to a chemist shop 100 yards ahead of me was currently 21 degrees. That's equivalent to a nice summer's day back in England. The people inside the stripy costumes must have been sweating buckets. Although I was slightly taken aback by this feline vision, Oscar appeared to take it in his stride. Had they been real cats, the domestic variety at least, he would have erupted into manic barking and set about chasing them from his territory. But all he did was stop and stare, and, as one of the tigers approached, his tail started to wag. It wagged even harder when the tiger crouched down beside him and made a fuss of him. "Who's a good boy? What a lovely dog." It was a woman, speaking in English, and from her accent she was Scottish. My Labrador is a very good listener, but I felt I should answer on his behalf. "This is Oscar. I'm sure he's very pleased to meet you." The woman stood up, and I saw her face peeking out at me beneath the tiger's slightly comical face, with its big staring eyes and whiskers. "Hi, I'm Amy. Are you English?" From what I could see of her, she was probably in her mid-40s, and from the colour of her cheeks, she was feeling the heat. "Yes, I am, but I live here now." She beamed at me. "You lucky man. Florence is so beautiful, and so wonderfully historic, isn't it?" I nodded in agreement. "It certainly is. I have to ask, do you always go around dressed like this, or is there a specific reason?" "Lorraine's getting married." She glanced sideways towards the rest of her group and lowered her voice. "For the third time. We're all beginning to think she only does it for the hen parties." "So that's what this is, a hen party. But why the tiger costumes?" "Oh, that was Lorraine's idea. She wanted cougar costumes, but we couldn't find any, so tigers were the next best thing. It could have been worse. Her original idea was harem girls." "I thought hen parties tended to take place in Magaluf or Ibiza or the like. What brought you to Florence?" "It was my idea. I'm a lecturer in medieval and Renaissance history at Edinburgh University, and I thought the girls would appreciate a bit of culture for a change. To be honest, the last time Lorraine got married, we all went to Marbella, and it was pretty gross." "That's a coincidence. Your subject, not Marbella. My partner lectures in medieval and Renaissance history here in Florence." Anna and I had been together now for a year and a half, and living together since last summer, so I no longer referred to her as my girlfriend. Partner seemed appropriate until we took the next step, if indeed we were to go down that route. An expression of astonishment immediately appeared on the tiger's face. "Do you mean Anna Gallardo?" I nodded, and she held out a stripy paw towards me. "Dr. Amy McIntosh. I've known Anna for years, ever since she used to work at Bristol University. I was thinking about looking her up while I'm here, but I don't have a phone number for her." I shook her hand, wondering what I should do. Amy McIntosh looked like a nice person, but I thought it wiser to check with Anna before handing over her phone number. So I made a note of the Scottish Tiger's phone number and promised I would get Anna to call. By coincidence, I was hosting a party this evening, and one more guest wouldn't matter, although a dozen tigers might upset the balance a bit. Tonight's event was being thrown by my new Italian publisher to celebrate publication of the Italian version of the first of my murder mysteries, set here in Tuscany, and I had decidedly mixed feelings about it. Although I'd spent 30 years of my life in the Metropolitan Police, my hobby had always been writing, and now that I'd moved to Italy, I'd finally been lucky enough to achieve my ambition of becoming a published author. The book had come out in English a year earlier, and was still continuing to sell pretty well, as did book number 2, which had come out just before Christmas. As far as tonight was concerned, they had told me that all I had to do was turn up, shake a few hands, say a few words, read a couple of pages from the book, and sign some copies for guests, but I wasn't looking forward to it. I'd invited some of the friends that I'd made since moving here 2 years ago, and the publisher had invited an unspecified number of local dignitaries, business people, academics, and even a few minor celebrities. But whether any of them would turn up was another matter. I bade farewell to the stripy medievalist and headed back to Anna's place. I still thought of it as her place, although I had spent most of the last 6 months living here. My own little house out in the country to the south of Florence came into its own in the hot summer months and at the weekends, but there was no getting away from the convenience of living only a 15-minute walk from the office. Private investigation business over the winter had been brisk, mainly the usual mix of unfaithful spouses, pilfering employees and missing persons, with occasional exceptions. Prime among these had been a mysterious creature invading a poultry farm to the east of the city and attacking its avian inhabitants. I had set up a series of surveillance cameras, with the aid of which the perpetrator had been revealed as a neighbour's cat called Napoleon. The cat might even make it into one of my books sometime, but although I still enjoyed my writing, I was struggling to find the time. Ideas for new whodunits continued to flash through my mind all the time, and as I walked back past Piazza della Repubblica, I wondered idly whether a group of Brits dressed in tiger costumes might form the nucleus of a convincing plot. Anything was possible. When I got to the Ponte Vecchio, I paused in the centre of the bridge and looked around. Even though Easter weekend had come and gone, it was still crowded with tourists. I looked out over the muddy waters of the River Arno, marvelling as always at how the level of the river could possibly have risen by 10 metres or more during the catastrophic floods of 1966. Now, even though winter had only just finished, the water level was still unusually low, and I hoped the predictions of drought wouldn't come true. My house in the country was set among olive groves and vineyards, and I knew that last year the local farmers had really struggled with what had been one of the hottest and driest summers on record. As I was an Englishman, it felt totally alien to be hoping for rain, but I knew that this was what was needed. The Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, was built in medieval times, and it has the distinction of being a bridge lined with shops. These tiny boutiques flanking both sides of the bridge, many actually sticking out over the sides, are now predominantly jewellers, although Anna had told me that back when the bridge was first constructed, they had mainly been butcher shops, and the stench had been unbearable. Nowadays, it's far more civilised. But, as a World Heritage Site, it draws millions of visitors every year, and for those of us just interested in getting from one side of the river to the other, it could be a real pain having to weave through the mass of humanity milling about there. The Medici family, Florence's most famous ruling dynasty, had foreseen this problem and ordered the construction of the Vasari Corridor, a private covered walkway built over the heads of the populace so they could get from their home in Palazzo Pitti to their place of work at the Palazzo Vecchio and back undisturbed. I often wish they'd given me the keys. Anna's apartment is on the second floor of a 16th century building, less than 100 metres from the bridge, and I found her with the ironing board set up in the middle of the living room. As Oscar trotted across to greet her, I realised that the garment she was ironing was none other than my new, very expensive suit. When I lived in the UK, I only ever used to buy most of my clothes from Marks and Spencer's or the like, but since being partnered with an Italian, all that had changed. Determined that I should look my best for tonight's party, Anna had marched me into town a week ago and had chosen an admittedly very smart, dark grey suit for me, but when I'd seen the price, I'd come close to making a run for it. Still, I told myself, it probably was time for a new suit, although the opportunities to wear it here were scarce. Work clothes for me nowadays were definitely casual. After years of collars and ties at Scotland Yard, the change had been liberating. Tonight, on the other hand, promised to be much more formal. Ciao, Bella. Thanks for ironing the suit, but surely it didn't need it. I haven't worn it yet. After her being married to an Englishman for 20 years and having lived in the UK, Anna's English is better than my Italian, so we normally speak English together. This afternoon she answered me in Italian, and I knew her well enough by now to realise that this meant that she was feeling stressed. "You're back at last. You said you'd be home at 3. Do you realise we have to be at the restaurant in less than 2 hours' time?" I checked my watch and saw that it was just after 4. As far as I was concerned, that was plenty of time to get ready, but I didn't say that to her. Instead, I headed for the kitchen and answered in Italian, "How does a cup of tea sound?" Oscar followed me into the kitchen, where his nose immediately pointed at the cupboard where his biscuits lived. Anna's voice followed me. "Yes, please, but don't make it too strong." After years of the Scotland Yard canteen, I'd grown used to tea strong enough to take the enamel off your teeth. But since meeting Anna, I'd had to change my ways. I made a mug of weak tea for her and a mug of slightly stronger tea for me, gave Oscar one of his bone-shaped biscuits, and headed back into the living room. As I did so, I remembered the tigers. "As I was walking here, I met somebody who knows you. Does the name Dr. Amy McIntosh mean anything to you?" Anna looked up from her ironing, and her expression was hard to read. On the one hand, there was surprise and pleasure, but on the other was something else, and I struggled to identify it. As somebody who had spent his working life trying to analyse people's reactions, this was a tricky one. It took me a few moments before I thought I'd managed to narrow it down to a mixture of embarrassment and pain. Why, I wondered, might that be? I listened with interest as Anna responded, "Amy? Well, well, well. I've known her for years. She teaches in Edinburgh. What's she doing in Florence?" I told her about the tiger costumes, and Anna's expression lightened a little, but there was still that discomfort. My curiosity increased, but I thought it best to let Anna tell me all about it in due course, rather than now when she was already a bit stressed. I was pleased to see her reach for her phone, so, whatever it was that was troubling her, it hadn't stopped her from speaking to the Scot. "Give me her number, and I'll give her a call. Shall I ask her to come tonight?" "If it's okay with you, it's okay with me. So go ahead and invite her, by all means." She made the call, and a 5-minute conversation ensued, during which I was relieved to hear her sounding fairly normal and not strained. I was also pleased to hear her suggest that the tiger costume might not be quite what was wanted for tonight's event. I sat back on the sofa and did my best to stop wondering what might have been behind Anna's unexpected reaction at hearing Amy's name. I took refuge in fiction, and, as so often, I let my imagination take over. And I was already envisaging a tiger-clad academic floating face down in a fountain, and another escaping from the police down the autostrada at 90 miles an hour, when Anna's call ended, and she came over to sit beside me, rousing me from my musings. "Right, she's coming." That strange, uncertain look was still on her face, but I saw her make an effort and return to the more pressing matter of what I was going to be doing this evening. "Now, do you want to go over your speech one more time?" I didn't really, but it probably made sense to do as she said, so I launched into it while she sat back and nodded approvingly. Her approval was probably less for my delivery than for the content, most of which she had been responsible for writing. Although I've done a fair bit of public speaking in my time, I've never been terribly keen on it, especially in a foreign language. I got to the end of it and looked over at her. Will that do? It doesn't come across as too boastful, does it? It's only a whodunit, after all, not an acceptance speech for a Nobel Prize. She reached over and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. It'll be fine, Dan. I'm sure they'll love it. I hoped she was right, but it was too late now to pull out of it. Instead, I found myself wondering yet again why she had reacted the way she had. It promised to be an interesting evening, in more ways than one. Chapter 2. Friday evening. I'm not sure whether they loved it or not, but my little performance seemed to go down all right, and I got a round of applause at the end of it. As I delivered my speech, I looked around the room and was pleasantly surprised to see so many people. Among the guests, I spotted some of my closest friends here in Italy, notably Commissario Virgilio Pisano of the Florence murder squad and his right-hand man, Inspector Marco Innocenti. Along with them was Virgilio's wife, Lena, who now worked for me as my PA, receptionist, secretary, and occasional dog walker. Beyond them was a sea of faces of other people, most of whom I didn't recognise, although the smartly dressed gentleman sitting with the representatives of the publishing house in the middle of the front row looked familiar. It took me a while to work out that this was none other than the Sindaco, Mr. Mayor himself. How they had managed to get him to come to this very minor event was beyond me. As soon as my speech ended, the managing director of the publishing company came up to congratulate me and to introduce me to the mayor. Like so many people in authority these days, the mayor was younger than me, probably by 10 years or so, and he was a charming and affable character. It quickly emerged that he was also a writer, in his case of historical novels set here in the city, and his books were published by the same company. No doubt this explained his appearance here tonight and the presence of a couple of newspaper photographers, for whom the three of us posed with cheesy smiles on our faces, or at least on mine. While waiters circulated with glasses of spumante and trays of nibbles, I spent the next hour or more answering questions from people, signing copies of my book, and generally doing my best to promote the new publication. It was almost 8 before I managed to get back to Anna, who had found a table in a corner where she and Amy McIntosh were sitting. I hadn't been present when Amy had arrived, and I was relieved to see them sitting together now and chatting, reassuringly normally, with Oscar sprawled at their feet. He looked up as he saw me appear, gave a lazy wag of the tail, and subsided into somnolence once more. Anna pushed out a chair for me and leant over to give me a kiss when I sat down. "I told you it would all go well, didn't I?" She sounded triumphant, and certainly much more relaxed than earlier. "Have you had a drink? You look as if you could do with one." I gave her a smile. I thought it best to stay off the booze, at least until I'd done my duty. I've hardly had a chance to speak to Virgilio or Marco or any of the others I invited. It's maybe just as well Tricia couldn't come. I doubt if I would have been able to spend more than a few minutes with her. My daughter lived and worked in the UK, and although she had indicated that she would have been keen to come to the event, her work as a solicitor had prevented her from getting away. "What about food? Have you eaten?" Anna was sounding more concerned. No sooner had she spoken than there was a movement at our feet, and Oscar's face appeared by my right knee, doing his unsuccessful best to look as if he was in the latter stages of starvation. When it comes to food, his comprehension skills are unparalleled, in English or in Italian. I shook my head, and Anna jumped to her feet. "Leave it to me." After she had disappeared into the slowly diminishing crowd, as people started to drift away, I looked across at Dr. McIntosh and saw her smile. "I had no idea Anna had found herself a murder mystery writer. How exciting!" I smiled back. "When I can find the time. I have a pretty full-on job, so the only time I can write is in the evenings if I'm lucky." "What do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" I have a private investigation agency here in Florence. I used to be in the Metropolitan Police Murder Squad until I retired a few years ago, so it seemed like a sensible new venture. How exciting! I've never met a private eye before. What sort of thing do you do? Is it dangerous? I was quick to disabuse her. It's not like it is on the TV. I certainly don't carry a gun, and I don't go around getting shot at least not so far. Most of my time spent waiting around spying on people. I'm afraid marital infidelity is what keeps me busiest, and increasingly computer fraud. I nodded towards her wedding ring. What about your husband? Does he have an exciting job? She smiled. He's a geologist, and I'm afraid I can't get worked up about rocks the way he does. He's currently working on something to do with diamonds, but sadly, he doesn't bring any free samples home with him. I glanced around, but there was no sign of Anna for the moment, so I allowed myself a few moments of being a detective. So, how do you know Anna, then? Now it was Amy's time to look awkward. We used to see each other at seminars and conferences, but it was only when we worked out that we had something other than history in common that we became friends. I caught her eye, and that same expression of embarrassment and pain I had noted on Anna's face appeared on her face now. We were both going through breakups, followed by divorce. She rapidly became my shoulder to cry on, and I became hers. She produced a wry smile, and we did a lot of crying. I gave her a sympathetic smile in return as it all became clear to me. Divorces are tough, you don't need to tell me. I've been through one myself. At that moment, Anna returned with a tray. On it was a plate containing a selection of tiny sandwiches, mini bruschetta, and slices of salami on squares of grilled polenta. There were also 2 glasses of fizz and a large glass of cold beer. She set the tray down, handed me the beer, and took a seat. Here, Dan, I thought you might be desperate for something cold. I blew her a kiss. You know me so well. I took a cool, refreshing mouthful and gave a happy sigh, partly fuelled by the drink, but more so by the explanation Amy had just given me. Ah, wonderful. I needed that. Now I can relax. We sat and chatted over our selection of snacks and drinks until, all too soon, I was summoned by the publishers once again to say goodbye to the important guests. I shook hands with a variety of people whose names I felt sure I would never remember, until it was the turn of the mayor. To my surprise, instead of shaking my hand, he took me by the arm and led me out of the door and into the street. I went with him, intrigued to see where this might be heading. Was he maybe going to warn me off the publishers? I certainly hoped not, as I'd already signed and sealed the deal with them. The sun had set, and it was almost dark, but the street was still busy. When the mayor was sure that we weren't being overheard, he started to speak, and I realised that what he had to say had nothing to do with books. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to put 2 and 2 together, but I realise now that you're the private investigator, aren't you? That's what pays the bills. I used to be in the police in London, and setting up as a PI seemed like a good idea. A very good idea, I'm sure. And you have an excellent reputation. Your name was mentioned to me recently by my good friend, the Questore. I gather you've helped out our local police on a few occasions. I sometimes lend a hand if there are English speakers involved. I found myself wondering just where he was going with this. The Questore was roughly equivalent to a chief constable or the police commissioner in the UK, and somebody who wielded a lot of power. I had heard of him, but had never met him. What, I wondered, had prompted such an august person to bring up my name? A noisy group of tourists came walking past, and the mayor waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. We can't talk here. I wonder if you could spare me a few minutes of your time, early next week, maybe Monday or Tuesday? I'd like to ask your advice about something confidential. Could you do that? Yes, of course. I'd be pleased to help in any way. When would suit you? I'll have to check with my secretary, but maybe we could have lunch together. Would that be all right? I agreed immediately, fascinated at the thought of what he might want to tell me, and we exchanged phone numbers before shaking hands. He congratulated me and wished me well with my book, and I was quick to offer my good wishes for his writing in return. He headed off in the direction of the Ponte Vecchio, and I went back into the function room, which was emptying rapidly. My intention was to return to where Anna and Amy were sitting, but I found myself waylaid when an insistent hand caught my arm, and I turned to see a wiry old man, quite possibly in his 80s, standing at my side. He had an unkempt mass of white hair and a bushy moustache, which gave him a slightly Einstein-like appearance, and the expression on his face was dead serious. I wondered what might be troubling this stranger, so I gave him a welcoming smile. "Good evening. Have you been here for the book launch?" He didn't respond to my smile.
"I didn't come for that, Signor Armstrong. I came because I'm interested in speaking to you in your professional capacity."
I took my time before replying, my brain churning. What should have been an evening dedicated to my murder mysteries was throwing up mysteries of its own. First, the mayor and his mysterious invitation to dine with him, and now this old man. I answered cautiously, "How can I help you, Signor Berg, David Berg? I have a jewellery shop on the Ponte Vecchio." His Italian was faultless, but I felt I could detect an unusual accent lurking there, although I couldn't pinpoint it. His name sounded Germanic, and I wondered if he was maybe from the German-speaking part of Italy, far to the north, near the border with Austria. As I studied him, I was struck by his hard face and remarkably cold eyes. Despite my initial impression of him, this was no charming old duffer. He might be old, but he looked as sharp as a tack and as tough as nails, and he certainly didn't radiate bonhomie. I answered politely, "And do you have a problem?" He nodded again. "I do indeed have a problem, and I need the help of a professional such as yourself." "Is it a business problem or a personal problem?" He paused before replying. "A bit of both." He stopped and waited as a pair of guests walked out past us and stopped to shake me by the hand and wish me well. Once they had left, he continued, "We obviously can't speak here." I suppressed a smile as he repeated almost the same words used by the mayor. "It would be best if you come to my shop, so I can outline the situation to you. The shop closes at 7:30 in the evening, so you should come at that time, or just after, so I can talk freely." Those hard eyes caught mine for a moment. This was a man who was used to getting his own way. "Don't worry. I'm prepared to pay for your services. Bring your terms and conditions with you." I agreed, and we arranged that I would come to his shop on Monday evening. We shook hands, and I made my way back across the room to where Anna was still sitting. She looked up as I approached. "You took your time? Everything all right? I saw you disappear out of the door with the mayor, and I wondered if he was about to offer you the keys of the city." I smiled and shook my head. Chance would be a fine thing. No, we had a little chat. I deliberately tried to keep Anna separate from my work where possible to avoid bringing work problems home with me. That had, to a great extent, been the cause of my original divorce well over 2 years ago, so for now I told her a little white lie. As we both now work for the same publishing house, we were just exchanging notes. "The mayor seems like a pleasant chap, and he's invited me for lunch one day next week. It's rather nice of him, isn't it?" Anna nodded approvingly, and Amy glanced at her watch. "I'd better go. The girls were going out for dinner somewhere in the centre, and then they said they were going clubbing. The last thing I feel like is a noisy disco, but I suppose I'd better go and keep an eye on them. They do have a tendency to get themselves into trouble. Thank you very much for inviting me to your soirée. It's been great to meet you, Dan, and to catch up with Anna. And Dan, the first thing I'm going to do when I get back to the UK is to buy a copy of your book in English." She gave us both a kiss, hugged Oscar, and left in search of her hens. I glanced across at Anna and smiled at her. "Amy told me you two were divorce buddies. There were times when I wished I'd had a shoulder to cry on when my marriage was falling apart." She smiled back, a genuine, happy smile. "That's all behind us now, Dan. Amy has her new husband, and that all sounds as if it's going well. As for me, I can't complain. I didn't just get a wonderful man, I got a sloppy Labrador into the bargain." Reassured that all was well with her, and me, I reached for the remains of my beer and settled back in my seat, wondering what my 2 brief encounters this evening were likely to bring. Was it just coincidence that the mayor of the city and a jeweller on the Ponte Vecchio both appeared keen to have the services of a private investigator? I looked forward to seeing how that worked out. Chapter 3. Saturday morning. Although it had rained in the night, it was a pleasant, sunny morning when I took Oscar for his early walk. There was still a bit of nighttime chill in the air, but it looked like being another sparkling spring day. I turned right outside Anna's front door and headed back towards the Ponte Vecchio. My intention was to turn right again when we reached the bridge and head up the hill past the beautiful Pitti Palace away from the town centre, so as to give Oscar a chance to stretch his legs without encountering crowds of tourists. However, when we got to the bridge, my attention was drawn to a couple of police cars parked across the entrance to it, with a pair of police officers in uniform effectively blocking access to this major tourist attraction. Intrigued, I wandered over and was pleased to see a familiar face. It was my old friend Inspector Marco Innocenti. I had first met him when he'd been a sergeant, and I'd always rated him as a very competent police officer. "Ciao, Marco. What's got you out of bed at 7:30 on a Saturday morning?" Oscar, spotting his old buddy, trotted over to greet him as the 2 of us shook hands. "Some guy's decided to hang himself off the bridge." After 30 years in the murder squad, I was no stranger to violent death, but it came as a shock all the same. Here? On the Ponte Vecchio? What a place to choose. Does it look suspicious? Marco shook his head. "Doesn't appear so. No signs of a struggle." "Is Virgilio there?" "I didn't get a chance to talk to either of you last night. Thanks a lot for coming, by the way." He shook his head. "The commissario's probably still in bed, if he's got any sense. I saw no need to get him out for something as straightforward as this. All right, the Ponte Vecchio isn't most people's first choice as a place to end it all, but when it's all said and done, from a police perspective, it's still pretty routine." He gave me a cheeky grin and changed the subject. "I thought your speech last night was great. Did you get lots of your fans giving you their phone numbers and throwing their underwear at you?" I grinned back at him. No such luck. But I did get an invitation to lunch with the mayor. A nudge of Oscar's nose against my leg reminded me of his priorities. Anyway, I'd better take Oscar for his walk. If you see Virgilio, tell him I'll give him a call later on. Florence is a frustrating city for dog owners. If you look down on it from above, there are numerous parks and open areas of green space, but so many of them are private and locked up behind high iron railings. The famous Bobbly Gardens behind Palazzo Pitti are only 5 minutes from Anna's house, but because they're categorised as an open-air museum, dogs aren't allowed in. As a result, over the winter months, I'd come up with a route along a series of narrow lanes leading up the hill to the south of Florence and back again, where we wouldn't meet much traffic. Today, this would give us both some exercise before we headed out to my home in the country for the weekend, where Oscar could run to his heart's content. When we got back to the apartment, I found Anna already up and dressed, filling a basket with provisions for the next 2 days. Decamping to the country at the weekends had become a regular habit over the winter, and as the warmer weather approached, it would soon be time to move out to Montevolpone permanently until the autumn brought us back into the city again. Not for the first time, I reflected on my good fortune. Being able to spend my life in such beautiful surroundings, whether in the city or in the hills, made me a very lucky man. Although I still loved much about England, I had to admit that Tuscany, with its historic beauty, its warm weather, and of course its wonderful food and drink, took a lot of beating. We set off in my VW minivan at just after 9 and were at my place by past. The little house I'd bought over a year ago is situated part way up a hillside, and access is up a fairly rough track dressed with chalky white gravel, one of Tuscany's famous strade bianche, the white roads. Anna told me she had stuff to do, so I put on a pair of shorts and took Oscar out for a proper walk. As I followed him uphill past olive groves and vineyards, throwing sticks and pine cones for him to retrieve, I thought back to the previous night. My forthcoming meeting with the mayor promised to be interesting. I still couldn't imagine what the confidential matter that he wanted to discuss with a random English private eye might be. I just hoped it wasn't political. Politics in Italy can be very confusing, and everybody seems to have a strong opinion about one party or another, and there are over a dozen to choose from, all with different acronyms, so I've always tried to steer clear of the subject. Of course, it could well be a personal matter, and when we got to the top of the hill, I pulled out my phone and checked up on him. Ugo Gallo was 52 years old, so almost 6 years younger than I was, and he had originally been an architect before becoming a politician. He had been married for 23 years and had twin daughters, both studying at Florence University. As far as I could see, his private life was unblemished, so it looked likely that the confidential matter would prove to be something else. I looked forward to finding out. As for the elderly man with the jeweller's shop who had accosted me last night, I hoped I wasn't to discover that he'd been the person who had chosen to take his own life on the Ponte Vecchio. He had certainly looked and sounded worried about something, but why would he make an appointment to see a private investigator and then kill himself only a few hours after making the appointment? This would make little sense, and besides, there had been that inner strength to the man that I had sensed. This, more than anything, made me feel it highly unlikely he would ever have contemplated suicide. Mind you, I told myself, whoever the victim was, he had chosen an iconic place to end it all. It was a beautiful morning, and Oscar and I walked for 2 solid hours, returning home shortly before midday, feeling hot, sweaty and hungry. In Oscar's case, this was no surprise. He was always hungry. As for me, in spite of a plate of sandwiches the previous night, followed by a quattro stagioni pizza, I had built up quite a hunger, and the first thing I did when I got home was to suggest to Anna that I would do a barbecue lunch. In the fridge, I had some particularly good pork sausages made by our local butcher, and a massive Florentine T-bone steak the size of a King James Bible that would have fed a family of 4. With this in mind, Anna made a sensible suggestion. "Why don't I do pasta for lunch to keep you going, and we invite Virgilio and Lina for a barbecue tonight?" I nodded in agreement and pulled out my phone. When Virgilio answered, his voice sounded a bit weary, and it took a bit of persuading to get him to agree to come out to our place for dinner that evening. Being a police officer is a full-on job, and I knew from experience that Virgilio lived and breathed his work, just as I had done until my wife left me.